Good morning, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for another VMware Tanzu webinar. Today's topic is that the future of software delivery needs DevSecOps. Today, we're joined by special guest speaker, Forrester analyst, Sandy Carielli, as well as VMware's very own David Zenzian and Brad Bach. Now, without further ado, let's hand this off to Brad.
Thanks, AJ. Great. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming to our webinar today. And as AJ mentioned, pleased to be joined today by Sandy Carielli, from our guest speaker from Forrester. Sandy's a principal analyst at Forrester. She advises customers on application security with an emphasis on collaboration between security and risk, application development, operations, and business teams. She's got over 15 years experience in the security space in various roles, from guiding strategy to managing product portfolios at some of the leading security firms. And then, as you mentioned, also we have our own David Zenzian from VMware, who brings over 30 years experience in various security-related roles, progressing from penetration testing consulting to co-founding a hybrid cloud security startup to serving as a CISO at a bank, an online bank. So we've got a great group here. My name is Brad Bach. I'm a product marketer at VMware. I've been here for 2 years, both in the modern apps business unit and in the networking and security BU. And prior to that, I worked at a technology company startup called Bitnami that was acquired by VMware. So great. Let's get started with today's topic. So, sorry, I'm getting used to the technology here. So if there's any hiccups here and there, bear with me. So basically, the topic for today is we're talking about, as enterprises with their own in-house software development teams accelerate the trend of moving to cloud-native app architectures and DevOps, people's perceptions of security is changing. There's been a long narrative that developers need to pay more attention and be more responsible for security. And while it's true they do have some responsibility there, developers' role in application security is also becoming a smaller portion of the overall security picture as open source application building blocks increasingly introduce their own security challenge, and they become more important in DevOps. And so with everyone feeling a lot of pressure to build and ship features at a rapid pace, there's been a corresponding shift in thinking about applications being part of a supply chain, much as you would see a supply chain in a aircraft manufacturing or something like that. And all of the inputs to those supply chains need to be secure. So the topic for today's discussion essentially boils down to this. Everyone recognizes that cloud native app development and DevOps are here to stay. They represent a drastic change in the way that software is built and consumed. But the cultural and technological changes in securing this new world still maturing. So we're here to discuss with Sandy and David what that future looks like, how organizations can ensure that they reap the security rewards that DevOps make possible, in addition to the speed and efficiency gains they're already making. So before we start, really quick, I want to ask the audience here to participate in a poll. So here it goes. When you think of application security and secure software supply chains, particularly in a Kubernetes and cloud native app context, what do you think, or who rather do you think is ultimately responsible for securing the software supply chain? AJ is going to get that started, and we'll check back in a few minutes. So Sandy, you've done a lot of research in this area, and to get the conversation started, it'd be great to hear what you've been learning as you talk with clients and kind of suss out what are the industry practices and attitudes around DevOps and security.
All right. Thank you so much, Brad. Hi, David. Great to be here today. Brad, as you were introducing the topic, you mentioned something that I think is worth coming back to, this sort of old thinking that you had to go to developers and say, you need to get on board with security, and really making it about, developers have to do these things in order to work with security. And what I'd say we're doing today is turning that a little bit inside out. As security professionals, we're trying to get more on board with dev so that we can align security into the developer experience so that, yes, development can build more secure products, but it's much more aligned with how they're building products, and we're really enabling them to build secure products rather than coming to them and sort of shaking our fingers and saying it has to be secure. So one of the things that I'll start with here, I'm an analyst, and a lot of times, we'll come out with statistics and stories and things that we're frustrated about or need to be improved in the industry. I'd like to start with something I'm actually kind of optimistic about, and that's what you can see on the screen in front of you. That's the reality that people are taking this seriously. Forrester went out and asked security leaders which initiatives are your top tactical IT security priorities over the next year. And rather delightfully, improving AppSec was number one. 28% said that that was one of their top priorities. That's fantastic. That really indicates just how much people are paying attention and realizing that application security is a really important part of the overall security environment, that it is something that needs real attention, that it requires consideration, it requires collaboration. And the other thing that you can see here that I'm equally happy about is this 21% that talked about building security into dev processes. Going back to what I said before, meeting the developers where they are, enabling development to build secure products versus going to dev after the fact and saying, okay, but this all needs to be secure by X, Y, and Z. So I have to say, after many years of, perhaps feeling as though we weren't as aligned or application security wasn't as important, we're definitely seeing a lot of leaders take application security seriously and take it seriously in a way that's about partnering with development to do the right thing rather than just throwing it over the wall to development. David, what do you think?
I think you've caught on to a big thing here. One of the things that you're seeing in the industry is this shift into a standardized development process, the whole DevOps lifecycle. And I think that's making it easier for security teams to meet at that table. In the past, you have every single development team, your .NET, your Java folks, each having different ways of doing their applications, their support, their security, all around it. And now that you have, standardized pipelines, you have, CI/CD, you have standardized registries, you're doing container-based workloads. It's a standard set of tools. It allows people to actually really think about how do we actually meet at the table here and make this work. And it's really interesting that, when you and I first started talking about this, you started looking into these stats and details. And the reality is this really is what you're seeing out there. There's this huge desire to really do better. And I think that enabling things, one of the biggest words you hear in this conversation is guardrails. How do we actually build things so that development teams and the business can move as fast as they can, as long as they're within those guardrails? But really the big question is, what is a guardrail? How does it work? How does it, what does it really mean in the reality of the world? And that's what we're going to discover, over the next few months as companies are really working more with this. So it definitely is seeing this same process you're talking about is happening out in the customer space that VMware works with.
That's a great point. What you said about just enabling this and making this easier. One of the things that I've seen is that a lot of the security tools are much better integrated with the dev tools. So that's much easier, from that standpoint, it all actually works together.
Yeah, remember the old world when you're doing the old stack analysis and you have to take your code, package it up in a certain format, and you're lucky if it can finish it in a day. Now, the expectation is it's integrated right into your IDE. You check code in, it does scanning in your Git repo, it does scanning in your container. Every step of the process has APIs integrations into them. I don't think we could have this maturity of security in DevOps if it wasn't for all that.
And it wouldn't be as high a priority because there would be more of a sense that it was, difficult, challenging, wasn't going to be as effective if we prioritized it. Part of the reality is that, we're able to prioritize it because we've matured.
And I think the security teams themselves are learning that they don't have developers on staff. And one of the things that came out of, like Brad, I came and joined VMware. Part of the whole Pivotal acquisition is the whole idea of a balanced team. The idea that, we're not in this, alone. We are in it together. And having security teams recognize that they don't have development expertise and they need to learn from them is I think, just making this capability even greater. And I'm really that first one here, the actual application security, that's where I'm extremely optimistic. I think we have enough real world scenarios over the last 10 years to know that the sticky part of attacking a company is the applications. And I'm really optimistic we're going to see some good changes over the next couple of years on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, speaking of that, let's talk about one of the realities there, that applications are the most common way in. I talked earlier about the things that I'm optimistic about. Let's hit on the things that I'm a little bit less optimistic about. And it's frustrating to see applications are still among the most common forms of external attacks. When we ask end users, when we ask security professionals, if you were subject to an external attack, how was it carried out? web applications, through SQL injection or cross-site scripting. 39% of respondents were victim to some sort of attack or breach through that. And then 30%, it was due to some sort of software vulnerability. Imagine, through including some sort of open source package or third-party package that had a CVE or other vulnerability, or your organization was exploited through that known vulnerability. Those are still common attacks. And what that says is that prioritization of application security is important because applications are the way in still for attackers.
And I think that you're seeing, like with the second part, the software supply chain that Brad mentioned earlier, the software vulnerabilities. There's one thing I'm really optimistic about the whole Kubernetes, container, be it Kubernetes today or whatever it is in the future, but the container-based, approach toward doing things. In the past, there were, you look at a development shop, like a Java shop, they're afraid of upgrading Tomcat or whatever the Java is because upgrades break things. And if we get into the process now where you can easily upgrade your Java, you can easily upgrade the root OS, and you should be upgrading them, if not daily, at least weekly. And if you're not, that's a great place to start. And just doing that one thing there, if you can cut off that 30% right there, software vulnerabilities, and you can upgrade to the latest version, and you're making sure that the containers and the systems that are running those applications are always in the latest version, that's 30% of the tax rate that you can just take off the table day one.
Yep.
That leads into a good question that just came from the audience. And I'm really glad that somebody asked this because kind of what you describe is a lot of the core part of DevOps. It's just updating things automatically. So, and I get this question all the time from developers especially. So I'm glad that somebody asked it. Is the sec really necessary in DevOps? Like we're talking about the title of this webinar has got DevSecOps in it. And a lot of people would say, well, that's just part of DevOps. Why are we adding sec into it? And is that just a buzzword?
Well, I would argue that the answer is, because we previously haven't necessarily added security into DevOps. We started with the automation and that collaboration between dev and operations and, building the pipeline together. Security didn't come along immediately. And if you build a good DevOps tool chain, that does not by default have all of the security functionality that you need. It doesn't have the pre-release scanning and a lot of the checks and the maintenance and all of that. So you still need to, even if you have a really strong DevOps pipeline, ask yourself the question of what are you testing? What are the security considerations you need? How do you make sure that you are building security in throughout that pipeline?
I'll even throw even a bigger thing is do we need to even call it DevOps? It's just the business. We're just doing business. And development is part of the life cycle of doing business. I think you're right there, Sandy. We're by putting the word sec in it, we're actually inviting security to the table and having that balance team I mentioned earlier, a chance to have everybody come to the table and feel like they're an actual real member of that party. But in the end, we're all just doing business. We're here to enable the business to solve the customer's needs in the end.
So do we call it DevSec business ops or something like that?
I'm not a marketing person, so I'm not the best person to answer what we should call it. All I know is we should be doing it. It's one of those things that, even down to the point of architecture, like you said, and I saw on the previous slide, the whole where should things fit in the cycle of things. If you design an application properly, it inherently has security built into it. You should, think about the one simple thing. Do you have passwords lock if someone enters an invalid password? That's security. That's building into the way you're handling responses to the application. And it's that mindset across all of it.
And building that into the requirements, making sure you're asking the questions early on and not waiting until right before release to production to ask yourself those things. That's not the time to make those decisions.
I think, I've heard kind of decision makers at companies too, you find it a useful framing of kind of an evolution of DevOps and kind of getting everybody on the same page, especially as a lot of vendors, more and more vendors are using it. They're looking to see who is in the space and who is kind of telling their DevOps story through that lens of security. How about some of the? Go ahead.
No, I was gonna say it's a good phrase that it means something, but the downside is depending on who you're talking to, it means something different. Mm-hmm. So part of it is coming to that common table, but the development team. We had this poll on. I think it'd be great if we can pull up some of the stats on that to add into here. The development teams think, well, security means it's a security team telling me what I need to add and do on my space. Security team means it's everyone thinks what it is from their the operations team, the dev team, the actual business owner. What do they think it means? And part of our problem is we've gone from an industry where we've had humongously built silos around every function in a company, and what DevOps is really doing, in my opinion, is just levelizing that. It's making it more of a commonality, and you're looking at things as a product. So you have a service or product a business is building that has all of these features that you had in your typical silos supporting that individual product. So it's more of a an equalization across the business for what those areas are.
David, you hit on something that I know you and I talked about earlier as we were starting to prepare for this webinar, the role of the security champion in this process of having people that are outside the security team, outside that silo, but are trained up in some amount of security awareness and skill and can go back to the security team, serve as bridges, help scale the team, bring the security team's credibility to dev and to DevOps and to IT and whatever teams they're part of, and really be able to address the security issues much closer to home, hit the low-hanging fruit, but then also know who to call when there's a more complex question.
So just an update on our poll. So curious how this aligns with, what we were talking about before. We have this poll. The question is, who's most responsible for securing the modern software supply chain and DevOps pipelines? And the choices were developers, app operators, platform operators, and security operators. And it looks like with just a slight majority of respondents said developers at 51%, 10% app operators, 8% platform operators, and 29% security operators.
And I'm really curious on that, if the developers are the ones answering it to developers, or if that's everyone thinking that DevSecOps is developers. One of these days we'll be able to get back in person with these actual live conferences, and we can actually have a great conversation with the audience, because I think it really is important to know where they're coming from.
Yeah.
So I think this is definitely a continuing conversation we hope to have beyond this webinar. It's just something that I'm seeing this change, and we're going to see a better matching of this. The ability to have a conversation in depth around security is essential to any business, and even if it's not the developer's responsibility, they definitely need to understand the concepts of why they're being asked to do this, so they can at least fit it into their everyday work cycles.
It may also be, David, I wonder if it's the developers that are seen as responsible for implementing the security policies, but still going to be on the security operators to actually develop and disseminate that so that developers have the knowledge to actually do that implementation.
And you also have the problem if you look at anyone from a regulatory, regulatory compliant environment, if banks or healthcare or places that have strong regulations on top of security, where they might have a separation of duty or segregation of duty requirement, where the interesting conversation you're seeing is everyone saying, well, it's on developers. They got to put in their pipeline, just saying, got to do all these things in their development lifecycle. But in a realistic point of view, the security teams are responsible and mandated by regulatory requirements that they have to be the gatekeepers of risk and helping manage that risk and security conversation. So you can't just push it off at any one group, I think is what we're all trying to say here, is it's going to have to be a combination. And what I'm starting to see is, developers might integrate a tool that the security is approved for doing certain things. When it comes for actually, setting up your connectivity of your service mesh, or setting up, the ingress egress definitions around your network policies or segregation controls, the security teams who are in charge of those spaces will want to be able to give tools to enable their customers, the developers, to actually enable those quickly. But at the same time, if it's within those approved guardrails, I have one customer, they've got a predefined list of several million predefined security groups. Then when the developers come on board, they say, I'm using these three applications. These are the security groups that apply to those, and it just integrates automatically into it. And it makes it easier to go down that path. But the definition of those groups and the configuration of those groups is done by security to put the controls in place so developers can't accidentally. And this is the biggest concern. Yep. The DevSecOps are like, oh my God, the developers can just turn on allow all and just make it work, because they need to make it work first. And it's that balance of how do we do security, and that paranoia that security folks have brought to the conversation. How do we balance that?
That's why you really have to automate the policy and actually have it implemented in the tooling versus something that you have to go outside of the process to get permissions or sign off or information. If it's built into the tooling, if it's built into the process, you know what you can do.
So that's a really good seg into our next section here, which is, where is DevSecOps implemented? And we have been talking a lot about who owns it. I think we've kind of come to the conclusion, or the right answer is everyone. But let's talk about how it happens in the context of the technologies people are using to construct software pipelines and the processes they're using to get apps from custom code to image to container running alongside other open source apps, things like databases and supporting services that were probably sourced outside of the organization. While we're at it, we have another poll. So this time, AJ is going to ask the audience questions about when in the software development lifecycle or DevOps pipeline they think security is most important. And there's 2 questions in this one. So if you can open that up, AJ will be taking responses from the audience here. And so this kind of brings up, and this is a question that just came from the audience too, really gets to this. Does the idea of DevSecOps inform technology and platform selection? As we shift left and put more security responsibility on the developer, can platform choice help with that responsibility? I think that's a great question that kind of tees up this, this kind of illustration of our end-to-end DevSecOps flow as we see it in VMware. In all of the red highlighted areas where there's some security element to that. So can you speak to that a little bit, David?
Yeah, this is actually what I tend to spend my days talking about. So this is something I enjoy, and some of the questions coming in, hopefully we can answer some of those as we go through this presentation of this step here. But on here, the tooling is a huge piece of it. Even on the beginning side, the platforms are, if you're looking at developing in Java or .NET, you just take Java and .NET, which you can. They're very mature languages. You can easily jump from them. But I would actually suggest looking at some sort of framework. Spring is a great framework. It's got a great open source tooling that goes with it. And with that, you're going to have, circuit breakers. So you can have, databases drop connections and won't break the application. You're going to have things built into there for secrets management and configuration management to help make that a better process to work with. And that fits all the way down the supply chain of the application lifecycle. So in this picture, what you're seeing is you're starting with the development itself, the services, and the design that we talked about. Sandy and I, we mentioned earlier, the whole design, security is built into the architecture of what you're designing. That's what's going to help script what the framework you're going to develop with, the tools you're going to put into your CI/CD pipelines, and throughout that, you're going to have your container registries, you're going to have your image repositories for pulling, where are you getting the images from? One of the biggest things I see as a question out there is, our developers just making a Docker file and pulling whatever image they have. How do we know where it's from? How do we know it's secure? What sort of things are made? Is it even updated? Is the place you're getting that from? Done an update since they first made the Docker image. And then separately, when you're running in a platform, there's a lot of things you need to think about. Kubernetes is Kubernetes, yes, but there's all the tools around the usage of Kubernetes and the interfaces to your tools that define ways you can and can't integrate this whole DevSecOps conversation. And then on the backside, you want to be able to monitor and maintain. You want to be able to have centralized policies and configuration, because you're going to start with one application. But if you're any size enterprise, you're going to have dozens, if not hundreds, of applications. And from that, you're going to have dozens, if not hundreds, of clusters, possibly in multiple locations for high availability. And how do you actually ensure you're going to have policies across the same, matching across the environment? Your backups are done according to your policies across the entire environment. How do you actually drive all that? So it's more than just a platform. It's the way they integrate with all things around them. Definitely, first and foremost, every platform, every tool should have an API. Everything today should be API driven, which is going to drive the fact of all the integrations you're going to have into it. And I think that kind of covered the platform question on that one, Brad. I'm not sure if there's any others we want to, I see a whole bunch of good questions here.
I would say I would ask the question that I saw come in that I really like here is, where's the biggest hurdle to kind of embedding security into the SDLC, the software development lifecycle? Like, what's the biggest challenge that we're trying to solve with this?
Well, I definitely have some opinions on this. I'm sure David does as well. It's not a technical hurdle. The answers are usually going to be around buy-in, around alignment, around dev and security communicating appropriately, around feeling as though there is that shared sense of ownership and no one's going to take blame. It's around empathy. It's around all the soft stuff. Mm-hmm. If you don't have that, that's where you tend to run into trouble actually building security in. If you can get everyone working together towards the same goal, on the same page, realizing this is a joint effort and everyone's willing to give a little bit, you're going to be a lot more successful.
Yeah, this is first and foremost a cultural shift. We mentioned earlier the silos, and going from a silo-based culture into one where everyone's working together is difficult. It's definitely one of the hardest things to happen. And I think with that comes with it a culture, a blameless culture. You can't do security if people are afraid that if they either bring up a security issue or something comes up from a scan, or heaven forbid, you actually get hacked. If you have a culture that doesn't know how to respond in a blameless manner, the idea here is to make things better, reduce risk, and make sure our customers and our service and our data are better every day than the last. That is the biggest shift. Now from that, actually talking about reality, what's the biggest part? There's so many things. If you just look at the cloud native community of all the services and tools integrated to the cloud native space, there's hundreds, if not thousands of different vendors, different open source projects, different people who have consulted and made their own tools around it. The best thing to do, in my opinion, is start simple.
Yes.
A handful of things. You're not going to be able to answer all the questions across the board, but decide, there's a couple of things. You can start with, what are you doing at least in the application? Are you looking at your third-party libraries? There's a set of common things around application development itself. Are you examining your third-party source? Are you looking at where you're getting your code from? Are you actually scanning the code for security? Because a lot of scanners, like if you're building in a registry scanner, you're looking just at the scanning of the containers, you're not going to see the code you wrote, because those are going to be based on your code, not third-party libraries. A lot of these scanners and containers are looking at the packages used to make up a container space, not over your application. So there's all these things around that piece that bite off small pieces. Even on the operational side, some of the platforms I work with, they can do 500 meg of log data a day before you load applications. So just saying, we'll monitor your logs. Everyone should just monitor the logs. Well, 500 meg a day is a lot. Now you start throwing an application on top of that, you can be doing several gig a day of just events. How do you even start with that? Well, the simplest way is, are you monitoring who's logging into the servers? SSH checks. It's simple, one simple thing. Find one thing, set up an alert, have it create something that causes you to, go look and see, did they have a ticket? Were they authorized to be on there? And then go from there. Add incremental. It's applying the DevSecOps lifecycle to security practices. So, decide what you want to focus on. Recognize there's 20,000 things you want to do with that. Choose one, make it work. Doesn't have to be perfect. Make it work. Iterate and repeat. Is that iterative cycle of just adding to it and making it better.
What I loved about that? You talked about, David, that sort of fallacy of just, look at the logs or just do this. Any recommendation that starts with just probably is not actually feasible. And I think what you said in terms of, really pick things and, choose your steps makes a lot of sense. One of the things I find myself recommending to clients who ask about DevSecOps is, you may have, dozens of products, dozens of different dev teams. Don't do it all at once. Choose one or two of your highest performing, most agile dev teams, build security in there, roll it out there where there's, most, willingness and flexibility and agility to manage it, and, learn, iterate, and then you can roll it out to the rest of the organization. But you don't have to do it in, one big bang.
This so that leads me to the next bit of data that you had, or based on your research, Sandy, that you had collected on kind of where, zooming a little bit out from the tools themselves, or like the individual parts, like where in the software development life cycle, where are your people you're talking to thinking that, or I'm sorry, it's where are they doing it today?
Doing it today and planning to do it in the future. So yeah, let me talk you through what this data is saying. We asked security decision makers, where are you implementing or planning to implement container security within the software development lifecycle? And the dark green are those that are planning to adopt in that phase of the life cycle in the next year, in the next 12 months. And the light green are those that have either already adopted container security, are adopting it in the process, or have adopted it and they're actually expanding their implementation as well. The thing that really jumps out at me here, and I want to go back to the poll question because I think there's a really interesting contrast here, is the emphasis on testing. You can see that 48% of respondents said they are planning to adopt in testing phase. whereas only 30% are planning to adopt in dev and only 19% in design. You can also see that where it's already been adopted is primarily in testing and in production, and there's not as much being done in production or planned to happen in production in the next year. I totally understand that testing is important, but I want to see this expand more in both directions, because containers need to be scanned and monitored for vulnerabilities both early in the life cycle so that they can be remediated before they even get to the test phase, but also as issues pop up in production, there's monitoring that has to happen on the container side. Look for permissions elevations and issues in communications between containers. So I'd really like to see this higher across the board.
I think it's really interesting, Sandy. You mentioned the poll, and I think the poll really is where, when you and I were talking about this, in the coming weeks before this webinar, was we both were in agreement that you can't really have a solid program unless it's designed that way. Which I'm very enthusiastic that the poll we had here, that was the 70%, definitely leader in this conversation here, which is huge. I don't think you can do any of this if you don't have a thought of how you can implement it.
And yet design was the area that fewest people had implemented and were planning to implement container security. So there's definitely a gap here, and we've got a ways to go to really push to fill that.
So we've got a sharp group attending the webinar today, is what we're saying.
Yes.
Because they're identifying the need to implement this stuff in the design phase. So how about, I think that's a great seg into our next kind of general topic. So we've been talking about kind of who's responsible and in what phase of the life cycle are they implementing DevSecOps. Let's look a little bit at the tools landscape and the platforms landscape, because everybody who's doing this, or most people, are kind of they're in some phase of adoption of Kubernetes and these modern practices. Nobody was doing this 10 years ago. And Kubernetes wasn't even around 10 years ago, but it's just caught fire and it's widespread in the industry and everybody's kind of going that direction. So a lot of vendors realize the importance of security, and they're making efforts to address a lot of the challenges with DevSecOps with point solutions or by building security features into their products and services. With VMware Tanzu, like the things that we offer for building and shipping applications through your software delivery pipelines. A lot of the things we're trying to do is focus on, give you transparency and information about what's in your applications as they go through. But we as we talked to customers about this, we quickly figured out that a lot of them hadn't even really thought through, like, okay, that's great to have all that information, but what do we actually do with it? Like, we need more tools, or we need to build something to consume that information and actually make decisions based off of it. Is that borne out in your research, Sandy, too? Or are you seeing that people are kind of still figuring out, even if they did have perfect information about all their software, like, what do they do with that information?
It's an interesting question. Yes, I do think there is better awareness now than there was. One of the things we talked about when we kicked off this webinar was that reality of turning the paradigm a little inside out and being much more aligned with what the developer wants. And I think what we're seeing is that organizations realize that a lot of things that they perhaps used to view as threatening, like open source, are a necessary part of development, so that now their job is to understand what open source libraries are in use. Or if they didn't realize that containers were even in use in their organization, they're taking the steps to understand and do that assessment to find out which applications are built that way. If there are applications that are API first, understanding what APIs are in the organization. So there is a sense that there is, I guess I would say, more of a need for discovery and more effort on the discovery phase in order to actually put in place the right policy. Is that sort of the direction you were going with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Basically, yeah, how are teams not only, we talk about, again, like all of these tools that people were using. I guess when it comes to the overall landscape of the ecosystem and the tooling, yeah, what?
Yeah. So let's talk about another aspect of this then. And David, I suspect you've got some thoughts on this as well. When we try to understand what's important to the organization and what's important to the developers, we need to remember that the overall goal of development is ultimately aligned with the goal of the business, which is to get product in the customer's hands, right? I mean, ultimately, if you're sitting there with security preventing product from being released to market so that nobody can use your stuff and nobody can buy it and you can't make money, you're not going to be in business for very long. And development is set up along, that process of investing in the processes and tools and methodologies that are going to allow it to get product to market quickly. So, some of the things we see around that, being able to speed up release cycle times. There's been a continued trend. More and more organizations are releasing monthly or more frequently. Increasing automation. And we've talked about that and the improvement in security tooling, for example, of integrating with various DevOps tools so that we can increase automation. And lo and behold, using more open source, because if we can use the open source and build that in, then we're not reinventing the wheel on every single component. And those are all part of dev team priorities, and they're important because those help you get to market faster. And ultimately, from the business standpoint, that's the name of the game. So as security folks, what we need to do is align to those, know that that's what's important to the dev teams, and therefore make sure that the processes and the tooling that we're recommending and engaging them on actually fits with that and isn't going to be, I would say, I guess, contrarian to their goals. David, what are your thoughts?
I think we we definitely agree on all of this here. And as I mentioned earlier, the whole idea that we're doing all of this, and the whole DevOps, DevSecOps conversation really is, how are we enabling the business? Now, there is the other side, because security is traditionally known as the Department of No, the ones that people avoid because they're going to slow things down, stop them. And that is a shift that's happening in security. They're really trying to be a better business enabler. But there's a huge mandate, and this is where developers need to meet the security teams at their table a little bit, is the security teams are mandated to help reduce the risk on the enterprise. It's great that we can have products come to market, but when we're talking like, say, let's the military or something happening in there where a mission is enormously responsible, and people can die if things happen, if they get compromised. And there are nation states looking at software, there's things happening. So there's a balance. How do we find, and that's where the big shift is, trying to figure out, how do we keep that balance? And that's where the guardrails comes in the conversation. How do we define things? In the federal space, you'll hear like the authority to operate. The idea that you can build a set of constraints that are approved for day-to-day operations. And that's where you're starting to see, federal government, usually it's like 18 months to get a software release out, because it's a lot of process to go through it. And I've seen in some of our federal customers, they're down to a week, if not less time, to get software out the door for the next release. And by doing so, they're showing that they're able to meet the same standard approved security constraints, because they've been looked at across the board of what is needed to get this out the door. And as long as they're in those constraints, it allows them to move faster. But the development teams, generally, you're not taught this in college. You're taught how to program in the language, and you go off and you start developing, and you really don't understand the fact that you're having people out there intentionally create, it's an age-old question of, I've made this form, no one's going to submit this weird value to it. And next thing you know, someone's submitting weird values. And one of the more recent things, SolarWinds came up recently. We have to, get the elephant in the corner of the room here on that. The idea that people are attacking, dependent libraries and in the third-party spaces to go after places. The idea that, companies, like I was reading a recent article, which was, I'm sure some folks here have read recently, where there was, someone shared, how did I actually break into PayPal? Well, they found a list of PayPal's, list of their libraries, either Ruby or Python they're using, and they said, oh, these three are actually internal, they're not in public repositories. What happens if I make a public repository with that name? Naturally, the pipelines are going to pull from the public source first, and they were able to inject code in there. So this idea of understanding your inventory, the whole vulnerability inventory management that security teams have been doing for decades now, is completely shifting. And even making it more complex, you can look at an application in the past where they might have had, maybe 100 servers running for a cluster. Now you might have 10,000 containers across 4 data centers of different versions as they're rolling in a blue-green deployment across for new updates. How do you look at the vulnerabilities of that and manage the risk of knowing that, well, everything we ship today is going to have a vulnerability? The question is, are we susceptible for an attack based on that type of vulnerability? So if you look at some of the things out there, let's say, there's a vulnerability in Python YAML. which is definitely happens all the time. But you're not actually using that function. How do the security teams work with the development teams to understand? This is a question I get all the time. Our customers come to VMware and say, we're using your product and we ran XYZ scanner on it and it's came up with this here. Are we vulnerable to this? And you have to go back to the development teams and say, okay, we know that this Python YAML has an exploit in it. Are we actually using that function? You have to actually do a risk assessment and determine, oh, we are not using that. So you're not susceptible to that, even though it got a vulnerable library included. And that's where the inventory management is coming in. The whole idea that we're doing inventory management on the libraries that make up the code that makes up the application, which make up the container. And then you have these fleets of containers deployed all around the world. How do you actually tie it all together? And that's, I think, some of the things that are we're going to see this in the next couple of years, tying this message together.
You mentioned SolarWinds, David, and I will tell you, as an analyst, a source of frustration for me a little bit is that while SolarWinds sort of brought to the fore this notion of supply chain security, and a lot of people started asking the question, are you using SolarWinds? Am I vulnerable to that? One of the things that drove me crazy when that was happening was many of those same organizations have all sorts of other components built into their applications, all sorts of open source that they're using. How many of those same folks that were asking their vendors if they use SolarWinds were also asking themselves about potential critical vulnerabilities that could already exist in their, in the open source libraries they're already using?
Mm-hmm.
So certain things make the news and they get everyone's attention, but this has been an issue for years and years and years.
It's not going away. And it's one is having knowledge, but then two, how do you quantify that knowledge?
Yeah.
And then apply it across your applications, your business use cases. And let's not forget your tech debt of those applications you've not updated in 7 years. The developer wants to go somewhere else. How do you even deal with that? That's something that I know that Brad, you and I have dealt with constantly here in the MapBU Tanzu side of VMware. Actually, we're dealing with applications. And I actually, this is one reason why I love the chance to work with companies on this conversation around modern applications. It's not just the current apps. We have to actually look at legacy apps, the stuff that has tech debt. And tech debt really has a cost associated to it that people don't really realize is a real hard cost. Just because you're not supporting something doesn't mean it's free. It's like open source. Open source might be free, but the cost associated to using it.
Free like free puppy, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think I see, we started off, we were all about efficiency with the products that I was working on. And we quickly realized that the area where people needed a lot of help and where they really, want to invest in going forward was on the security side. So that, that's for me personally, I mean, I've seen it as I'm talking about our products with lots and lots of customers. It just, if I'm talking to a security person, I feel like, they have an expectation or a need that these security features are kind of baked into the products and services that we're selling. So it's almost like, we were talking about how DevSecOps is kind of everybody's responsibility, and it almost, the vendor actually is in that mix as well. It's if people are buying something from you, they have an expectation that, you're providing some way for them to see what's going on with the software they're consuming from you.
That's a huge piece, Brad. I think that's what actually gets me up in the morning, and I love, is spending my waking hours talking to customers. In the years I was in the industry, as a CISO or other things, there are very few vendors I've ever worked with that you could call up and say, I have a security question around X, Y, or Z, and they want to talk about their product, their specific one single channel of my product does X security thing. I'm a vulnerability scanner, or I'm an inventory management, or I'm whatever it might be. And the thing that really is intriguing in working with customers on the applications is applications are across the board. And Brad, you hit the nail on the head. When you talk to a security person, it's different. Like if you're talking about these platforms and these tools to build with, the development teams, the product teams are looking for functionality. They want to get things up and running fast, get it out the door, get it moving. Security teams want to know, well, what makes up this application? Are you deploying pods within my containers to manage my clusters? How are they talking to each other? Is there TLS? Is there MTLS? What libraries are you using for your encryption? Is it FIPS supported? All these little details that security teams get into that they're not important to the buyer side of the business, but they are critical to making sure that the services that they're getting from their vendors are fully evaluated. And I would expect anyone who's going to have these conversations needs to turn to their vendors and expect someone, if not like me, someone similar to me who is going to have that full cycle of security conversations across everywhere your business is going to work with that vendor.
Yeah, that's a great point, David. How often do you find yourself having to answer those questions, as someone representing a vendor?
Every day. I spent hours last week with multiple banks, with space agencies, with 3-letter agencies all across the board, and every single one of them wants to have in-depth, detailed dives in how does the software work. How, when we're talking software, we're talking how does Kubernetes work? How does the actual management components and the service meshes and all these things fit together? Because they're so complex now. Now it's not just API-driven software; it's layers. And I'm sure if people have seen the pictures of Netflix, what does Netflix look like with all the microservices that are in there? That's modern applications. There's a lot of things happening in them, and you need to have a big architectural picture to it. And that's it's the best conversation in the world. I'm having the best time ever talking to these customers.
That's awesome, David.
So we have one more kind of topic, and this is a great seg into that, about kind of knowing when you're successful. How do you measure success? So just to introduce that, how do you build measurement into the automation? How do you know where the improvement needs to be made or where you're doing great? What kind of metrics are people using today? And are they consuming information about their security posture? How are they improving things like reaction times to vulnerabilities? And Sandy, I know you've written about this in the past. And I'm sorry, I'm kind of giving you guys a flood of questions just to kind of get our thoughts processes going here. How is security auditing changing in a world where traditional practices don't really make sense anymore?
That's a good one. Yeah. One of the things when I did some research on container security last year, in talking to various owners of that, and both security professionals as well as IT and DevOps professionals, there's a paradigm shift with containers in terms of what the expectations are and the scale and how they're deployed. And if you come in as an auditor or someone trying to look at this and you just think, oh, well, that's just a smaller VM, I just approach that the same way, you're going to run into trouble in about 15 seconds. It'll happen as soon as you give the piece of paper to the internal person saying, I want you to provide me a list of all the containers in your environment, and they left you out of their office. But it's probably a common mistake to make for people that are unfamiliar with architectural changes. And I think you could argue that, with other changes in development architecture as well. Some of them, there are certainly patterns. There are things that you sort of say, okay, well, you need to take this sort of life cycle approach. You need to ask these types of questions. But it's not just the same old, same old. So spending a little bit of time understanding, what it means to be running containers and what are the additional, security risks associated with that, and what are the changes in how you need to look at the environment as a result, that's going to be really important. The other part of that, though, going back to what you asked first, Brad, you asked about metrics, and I suspect that David and I can dive into this quite a bit. I know I have opinions. I think you do as well. There are a lot of metrics out there. It's probably one of the areas where organizations still struggle the most. Sometimes I think they are pressured by higher ups in their organization to provide certain metrics that don't make a lot of sense, and there needs to be more of a pushback. I have been told by, in the course of interviews by a lot of folks that one of the metrics they hate early on is just bug count. And I think, David, you mentioned earlier the problem with bug count is that it produces this accusation and sort of security shaming. Mm-hmm. When what you really want, particularly early on when you're introducing security, is for people to learn and sort of accept that there are things there. There's a lot of, as you said, technical debt. There's a lot to learn. We're going to improve it. If you track bug count from the beginning before the organization is matured, you're going to see a lot of things that aren't representative and are going to make it look worse. One of my favorite metrics is tracking time to remediate. How quickly can you fix things? And track that over time and see if your time to remediate decreases as people become more mature, as people catch issues early, as they understand what it means to fix, a SQL injection bug, as they're able to do that in dev when it's alerted in the IDE versus waiting until it comes up in a production, pre-production scan. But I know you've got some opinions here.
I'm actually going to tie into that one a little bit and into one of the last questions that came in here on the cultural changes that are happening. So it's been typical in security departments to track, mean to upgrade, patching, how long it takes to patch. And the one thing that's really nice about a DevOps environment is the automation. You should have automated pipelines. If you have a new root OS for your container, it should automatically generate a new image. It should go through your functional testing automatically. If it has any failures, kick it back to your developers. But if it has no failures, it should proceed out into your registry and then be pulled out into production immediately. You should expect, and you should also expect this from your vendor. If there's an OS problem for the VM that runs the Kubernetes cluster, you should expect to see an update from the vendor on that. As readily available as that's out there, it should be automated. So what I'm seeing and I'm expecting to see is on the infrastructure side, everything except for your code you developed or the third parties you tie into it a little bit, but not too much, because even those, they're going to have patches that should be automatically upgraded. So if there's a new version of a third-party library or a root OS or the actual build pack, the Java, the JRE, the .NET, Core, whatever it might be that runs the code, those components should be automatically upgraded. And I would expect to see those almost weekly, if not faster in some places. And then your code itself is a separate conversation. That's where you need to have an analysis of saying, well, is this really a SQL injection or not? And that's where there's tools that are better integrated for doing some more modern app testing. As you mentioned, it should be if a developer's doing code in the IDE, it should tell them they're writing code that's having a problem. The patterns for SQL injection are very well known. Now, what I would love to see is more of that standardization. The security department says, hey, we're going to use Spring for our framework to build things in. We're going to, we've seen 7 applications developed. Why are we rewriting the same IO functions, login functions, all the, the typical type of things you develop around an application? Standardize that. Make that a common place that the company can work from. And that way the developers can focus on the features of the application, not those underlying things. Like you shouldn't have to have a developer go, I'm going to go and make my own logging routines because I know they told me I have to log everything I'm doing out. Why? Because every developer is going to come up with their own mechanism for logging, their own output format, their own structure to it, which means the security team now has to have different templates for ingesting the logs from each application. Just standardize a template, have a library put together in your framework that you develop in, and just say, use this. And if you need to iterate and make that better, do so. And that ties into one of the last questions that came in here is in a large organization, how, this is not just any large organization, but any company is trying to get features to their customers. Features are also, they're always like, oh my God, we got to get the features out. How can we get security done when it's such a big focus on features? And I will say, if you go back to where does security start, and you've architected security into your application, if you're doing this agile development, you're going to have a sprint every week. And every week you're going to start off and you have your stories of what you're going to cover for the week. Do your iterative process of looking at the stories, coming up with them. Tied into the stories should have the security story as well. So it should not be a feature or a bug. Security is part of the everyday cycle of an agile life cycle. It's not just one new feature queued up. It's every one of the features you're working on that week has a yes or no. Is security involved in this? There's a bank I worked with a couple of years ago that one of the most successful things I've ever seen. We had 53 applications we deployed into production in less than 7 weeks. And the way it happened is security was there when the agile stories started on Monday. And they said, oh, here's your 10 stories you're working on this week with the different development teams. I, from security, because I know the governance and compliance requirements of the company, say, on this one here, here's the 3 things I need to have in here, and here's my test case at the end of the week. We went through all those things as they iterated, and they just developed it. They kept that in mind. If you're working on something that deals with logins, okay, well, it has to have power passwords, locking of accounts. It's a known set of patterns. On the backside, they test it. Security signs off on it. They go right to production with it. So if you include it in the design step, it's not a feature. It's not a bug. It's just meeting the requirements we need to have security as doing our regular everyday job.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. That's absolutely spot on. It needs to just be built in as part of the requirements. We run into trouble when we try to add it on at the end.
How about if I'm a security operator or somebody on the security team? We were talking earlier about how security is not just the remit of the developer building the application. How do I measure myself if I'm a security person, whether I'm supporting the application developer team well or enough? Or is that something that you think needs to be measured?
Interesting one.
I'll throw it Go ahead, Tanny.
Go for it, David. No, go for it.
So I'll go back to the idea of a balanced team. And one thing I like the idea of, and something that I've actually worked to do in my life, is put yourself in the developer's shoes. Actually go work with the developer team for a week and see what their world is like and how well or what you're saying, the things that you're saying on them to do. Actually, work with them. You may not be like a developer in the team, but you can actually work amongst, just pair up with them and sit next to them while they're working and see how it impacts their day to day. See where they're fighting against it. See how you can make that better. And the idea that you can pair up with people and you can cycle with people. And I think it's also important. Your developers also cycle into security teams. They don't understand that world. And the more you can have people see each other's side of the table, the better you're going to have that integration happen.
The other thing I'd add on to this is you could actually ask. You could do, CSAT types of polling for all of your internal customers, whether that's dev, whether that's IT, and ask them, how well they're working with security, what else they need, and measure it, from that standpoint as well.
That's a good point. It seems obvious, but it's always good to just ask someone, hey, how am I supporting you and how's it going? So we have just a couple minutes left. Just wanted to quickly, because we had one more poll question, and I thought as we're talking about measurement, great opportunity to hear from our audience on where they think security or where in the software development lifecycle security is being implemented well today, which is interesting because we see people saying about 35% say it's being implemented well in the design phase and 39% in the production phase. And not so much in the development and testing. So again, interesting contrast to the data that you had there.
Yeah. That's interesting. I suspect that speaks to, as much as we say there is more maturity in integrating into the life cycle, into the tool chain, integrating security tooling with DevOps tooling, that varies a lot by organization. And if you're in an organization where you still have a lot of gaps in terms of your tooling integrations, if your developers still have to go to completely separate UIs in order to resolve security issues, that's not good. Yeah. So I wonder if maybe that's some of what's coming up there. David, I don't know what you think.
I think that it goes back to our audience, can we figure out where are they coming from? And I look at who Forrester normally surveys. It's going to be these large global enterprises. You're going to talk to the leadership in these companies, and these are companies that have the money, that have bought tools, and the best tools you buy go into pipelines, and they still have the silos out there, and they've not done this cultural shift where I think the folks who might be listening today might be a bit more agile. They might be from a startup culture. It could be almost anywhere. They might have some enterprise folks. I saw a couple of questions on large enterprises, but I think the poll might just reflect the audience of who we're talking to here today versus who you normally talk to in your regular Forrester research.
Yeah, interesting point. And I'd, love to have some follow-on discussions with, with some of those folks and get a little additional feedback. So, if anyone wants to talk to me about what they're doing, I'm always interested in hearing from end users.
Awesome. Well, listen, this has been a really great conversation. I thank you so much for joining us today, Sandy, and thanks, David, for taking the time out of what I know is an extremely busy schedule to help us out. Couldn't have been a better discussion on DevSecOps, so I'm really glad that we had this discussion today. With that, I'll turn it back over to AJ to wrap up.
Great. Thank you, Brad. Once again, thank you, Brad. Thank you, David. And a special thank you to you, Sandy, for joining us today. But most of all, thanks to all of you for joining us for this hour presentation. This has been a great discussion. Thank you for participating in our polls and asking us all the great questions, for downloading the assets. And one last ask for you guys, just to let us know how we did, how we can improve, and what you'd like to hear in the future by leaving us feedback using the Rate This tab below. This presentation has been recorded and will be available on demand shortly after the presentation. For all the questions that we were unable to answer, we'll save them and we'll email you guys after the fact. So I know that answers your question there, David. But once again, thanks to all of you for joining us. We hope to see you at our next event. Have a great rest of the week. Bye, everybody.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.
Thanks.